Hello, my name is David Müller, and today I want to talk about Miloslav Kabeláč's cantata Nearest to Poetry, Opus 7, and musical resistance between compositional progress and appellation. The cantata Nearest to Poetry was written in 1939 as a compositional reaction of the occupation by the German Nazi regime in the Czech Republic. But it just premiered in the year 1945, so after the war. My outline is, at first I want to show you the thematic material, then the composition techniques of Kabeláč, then the special instrumentation in this piece, then marching military elements, then the dramaturgy, and at the end a conclusion. The theme is built up in two halls, which I call B and B1. And B1 is a varied sequence of the original part. The core motif I called A, and Kabeláč uses kind of expansion technique, intervallic expansion technique, to generate this theme. For example, in A there are just two notes, then there are three notes in A1, and then he builds up the theme gradually. He uses just the octatonic scale, so the whole tone, half tone scale. So this means that Kabeláč isn't thinking anymore in major minor tonality. It's already kind of more proportional thinking, more thinking in intervals, in interval structures, and not in major minor. Here we have some transformations of the theme A. In the first example, there are some small intervallic changes. In the second example, we have a very free rhythmization of the core motif. In the third example, we have kind of intervallic expansion technique. A major second gets to a minor third, and a minor second gets to a major second. So he spreads up the intervals. And in the fourth example, there are also some intervallic changes, and the theme is in augmentation. The second theme is exposed by the choir. Here you can see additional composition techniques. There are additional intervallic techniques. +1 means a half tone, and this is a very typical composition technique for Kabeláč. Outgoing from minor second, here are increasing intervals, and it's kind of multiplication technique. So you have +1, +2, +3, and this is very abstract thinking in interval structures. In the second half of the theme, there is a close relationship to the first theme, for example, the dotted note. But here you can see the additional technique too. And in this theme there is kind of tonal frame. It's in F minor because of the leading tone and because of the exposition of the F minor triad. In the middle section of the cantata you can find a polymodal passage. If you look at the two upper voices in this example, if they go upwards, they always go a whole tone upwards, and downwards always a half tone, so the chromatic scale. And if you look at the lower voice, it's always the other way around. And because of this composition techniques, there are many diminished and augmented chords, and he exposes the tonal center, which is the minor in this case. And even because of his composition technique of the polymodality, there are also some dominant chords which I marked in the example. On the other hand, Kabeláč uses very often counterpoint techniques. For example, in the example at the top, you can see an inversion in stretto between the tenor and the bass too. Or on the left you can see a diminution of theme 2, and on the right you can see an augmentation of theme 1 and then of theme 2. If you look at this example, we have in the tenor, again, the additional technique. The first interval is the major second, then the minor third, and then a major third as frame intervals. And if you look into the bass 2, there the first intervals of each measure are first a major second, then a minor third, and then a major third. So he uses the frame intervals of the tenor to build up the counterpoint in the bass. If you look at the tuba, which I marked green, it's a varied inversion of the second theme, and this becomes the counterpoint. And the tuba is also in canon to the contrabassoon. And if you look at the chord I marked red, it's an augmented sixth chord, especially a French sixth chord, and it's a dominant chord, which is often used as a double dominant, but also functions as a normal dominant chord. Here is an example of counterpoint and Kabeláč thinking in different layers. If you look at the tenor, there is a varied first theme, and if you look at what the bass is singing, bass 2 especially, it's the same theme in augmentation. And if you look at the end of the example, they are switching roles. And as in addition to that, the trumpets and horns are playing the second theme in diminution.
You could summarize Kabeláč's composition techniques as thinking in fixed scales, mostly based on interval structures and not focusing on tonality, then the additive expansion of themes or motifs based on interval structures, and uses very often basic contrapuntal techniques. So because of this, there is a very reduced material in the whole cantata. Tonality uses tonality as a frame. His main focus is on the composition techniques, and these are constructed to give tonal allusions. And tonal centers are fixed by repetition or pedal points, dominance on important places, and modulations via leading tones.
The instrumentation is for male choir, winds, especially brass instruments, and a very big percussion group. As you can see, the trumpet is the highest instrument, and later in the cantata there is a citation of a Hussite choral in the trumpets. But generally he's focusing on low instruments and percussion instruments with no pitch. But the lower instruments are very difficult to instrumentate, because normally if you build a chord in the lower range you just have the root tone, and in the upper voices you have the chord spread up. But so the sound is very dark of this orchestra here.
Kabeláč uses very often percussion instruments, for example in the pieces 8 Inventions or 8 Ricercares for percussion. He uses often percussion instruments as melody instruments. For example, at the beginning of the cantata, the first 7 measures are just played by percussion instruments. And he uses percussion instruments in a very polyphonic way with a very nuanced instrumentation. For example, as you can see in the here in the example, in measure 10 there is a very nuanced instrumentation because he changed the percussion instrument for the second part of the theme. Kabeláč tries to eradicate the differences between voice, percussion, and wind instruments. He is, for example, he's using the voice as pedal point in a repetitive way. Usually drums are used to mark the beat, like in this example here. and the text gives the voice even a percussive element, especially in the Czech language. And he uses very low winds and very low voices with the male choir, so the pitches are less differentiable, and for this speaks also the use of minor seconds.
Uses marching military instruments in the cantata, especially in the marching parts. Timpani and trumpets are since centuries the most common military instruments, and they are very present in this work. And he uses the march and military instrument elements in a distorted way. For example, changes of meter interrupt the marching, or if you look at the first example, the timpani, it's a tritone. You would expect normally a fourth. Or the second example, it's a fanfare of the trumpets. You would expect a major chord and not just one note. And in the third example, as I already said, the choir takes the role of normally the drums.
The dramaturgy of the cantata follows a ABA conception with a final increase, like per aspera ad astra, and the B part contrasts to the martiale A parts with a slower tempo, a lamento part with diminished and augmented chords and scythe motives, a declamation part, quasi recitativo, where you can just hear bass 2, with a minimal instrumentation and minimal tension. There are sle matichko sle interjections of 3 solo tenors after each verse in the declamation part, and these are repeated every time a major second higher. So from the minimal tension we have an increase of tension to the end of the B part by higher pitches which correspond to the text.
The final neo-poetic chord is omnipresent throughout the recapitulation, which is almost 100 measures, and the chords build up gradually, beginning with one note and then more and more. At the very beginning of the cantata, the minor seconds in the timpani, like an example, are already anticipating the minor seconds of the neo-poetic chord. In the lamentation part, the C minor tonality is fixed by repetition, and C minor associations are complaint, which said Schubert, and since Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, C minor is a very tragic. We also got an increase of tension towards the maestoso coda, measures 236 to 260, corresponds to measure 188 to 236 in almost exact diminution, plus the neo-poetic chord gets more and more present with a more dense instrumentation. In the coda, the Hussite chant is cited in the trumpets, while the choir sings unisono choral-like, a choral-like melody based on the first theme, so we got a combination of different semantic layers to transport the message. And trumpets are the highest instruments, so you can hear them very good, and they have a and we have here the appellative potential of chants. And in addition to this, it's the only functional tonal part of the whole composition.
So how is the message of the text transported? Firstly, by repetitions. The first theme is exposed 2 times before it occurs in the choir, so the focus could be only on the text. There are important keywords which are repeated many times. For example, sle matichko sle is repeated throughout the whole middle section for 17 times, and the repetition of the neo-poetic at the end, for sure. Pochke pochke, pranipurgo pochke, puidema tb is used as the ostinato pedal point in repetitions, while another text is in other voices. So the underlying meaning is omnipresent, and this technique was also used in motets of the 14th century. And Kabeláč used texts which are known by the people, and also melodies which, like the Husit chants, which are known by the people, so he can transport the message better. In the declamation part, the text is just declaimed by one voice, with almost no accompaniment. So you can focus on the text and it's very comprehensible. Important text is in larger note values, like at the end the chant-like part in the maestoso finale. And Kabeláč uses a very reduced material, so the focus could be on the text. To conclude, at the one hand we have compositional progress, because of thinking in intervallic structures, polymodal thinking, a very innovative instrumentation, and a focus on percussion instruments. But on the other hand, we have a very big accessibility in this piece with the chant citation, popular text. The formal conception is very easy to understand. There are mantra-like repetitions and tonal centers, and for both points there are march and military associations, but in a distorted way. But we can say that the cantata Nestor Poite is a cantata in between compositional progress and accessibility. Thank you for listening to my presentation about Kabeláč's Cantate Nestor Poite. Here is some additional literature I used.